So this is a review of Gundam Breaker 4, as somebody who has played all the previous Gundam Breaker games, but I've never really interacted with Gundam outside of the games, and yeah, I think I've been able to come to a kind of decision as to how I feel about it at this point. Now, I haven't completely finished the game. I think there are still a few story missions left. I think I'm gonna say more than halfway through the story, so I think I've seen almost everything the game has to show. I did all the side missions up to this point. I've tried everything at least once, so I've kind of covered everything, but I haven't seen all of the content, you know, so I guess there is the possibility that I've missed a few bits here and there. And basically, I think a good place to start would be to look at the previous games, because a lot of people may not have played the previous Gundam Breaker games, seeing as this is only the second Gundam Breaker game that was released in English-speaking territories, meaning Europe and US. So Gundam Breaker was a fun, more anime version of something like Armored Core, and it was a solid start to the series, but it definitely needed some tightening up and just a few things needed to be changed. I think it was a great start, and again, you have to consider the time that it came out. It was a PS3 game, and I just think it was, for what it was a great entry, and it showed people that, hey, this is a new direction for Gundam to go in. I think players really enjoyed it. The big difference between the Gundam Breaker series and all the other Gundam series is that Gundams tend to be just a character in and of themselves, so you don't really mix and match parts between Gundam. I think it's more like, you know, you have those Lego minifigures and you can kind of maybe take the head off of Homer Simpson and put it on Obi-Wan Kenobi's body. You know, it's not something that's really done because it can break the immersion, but some people do it, and I think Gundam builders in Japan started doing that, and it became kind of a thing, almost like, you know, aftermarket parts for cars and stuff. It was just fun to experiment with different configurations, and people came up with some really cool stuff. So that's what these games are, right? And yeah, the first one was just an intro to that, and it was kind of an homage to those kind of Gundam builders. I think Gundam Breaker 2, when that released, it was just a much tighter game. It had a lot of neat little additions. It had more customization. There was new ways to fight, like you had vehicles that you could mount and stuff. The levels were slightly bigger, slightly more varied. I think there were different modes as well, you know, and I actually played Gundam Breaker 2 on the Vita primarily, so especially on that system, seeing, you know, how much you can get out of a Vita and being able to play a game of that magnitude was just very impressive at the time. Yeah, I was really happy with Gundam Breaker 2. I think it was just a great step forward. And then Gundam Breaker 3 was released, which for me is the pinnacle of the series. I think it had the absolute best customization to date. The levels were by far the most interesting, and there were like new modes. You had all these, you know, defense missions. You obviously have your team deathmatch, and there were more linear missions too that would, you know, take you through a long level, as well as the addition of the SD Gundam, which were, I think SD stands for Super Deformed. They're like the little kind of chibi characters. And yeah, speaking of SD Gundam, I also played SD Gundam Battle Alliance, which I guess really isn't a Breaker game, but I just think playing that between those games and the ones that were released here in Europe at least really showed me that, alright, the Breaker side of things isn't the end-all be-all of Gundam games, because you can just have fun gameplay and fun levels without needing to have that customization, but it is fun. And then actually after that, actually I think it was before that, New Gundam Breaker was the first game that was released in English-speaking territories. So that one was, I think, maybe a slight step back from Gundam Breaker 3, but it had some nice little things, like you could change out parts mid-battle. Like if your arm got blown off, you could pick up one of the enemy arms and attach that there and then. I thought that was a cool little thing, but it didn't really change how the game played. It was just a nice little addition. To me, that game felt more like an introduction to the Gundam Breaker games. It was just kind of simplified in a lot of areas, and you'll notice I haven't spoken about the story in any of these games, and I don't think any of them need to be spoken about. None of them are particularly interesting. Maybe it's just me, maybe some other people will get more enjoyment out of them, but it feels like in all of these games the stories are just there to get you from A to B and to give you a reason to do these battles, but none of them have been particularly interesting, and none of the characters have been particularly engaging. I think that the character designs are always cool, but the characters themselves are just whatever. And yeah, that's new Gundam Breaker, and that was all that we had until now. We have Gundam Breaker 4, which unfortunately is only released digitally here. I think in the US you have it physically, but here in Europe there's no physical release, so I actually had to import a Japanese version, which is, it's the same thing and it has English in it, so that was fine by me. And now we actually get to Gundam Breaker 4, so that was a lot of preamble for just Gundam Breaker 4 being a step back in many ways, even from new Gundam Breaker. And I feel it was important to have that kind of understanding of the previous games if you haven't played them, maybe. Yeah, my first recommendation, and I'm gonna say it now, if this is all that you've come for, is just play Gundam Breaker 3. You can import a version from Asia that has English in it. The Japanese one does not have English, but there are Asian versions that do have English in it. I think the Hong Kong version, maybe the Singapore version. It's usually one of those two if they do have English, because it's just, that's a better game. Gundam Breaker 4, it feels like they really tried to focus on making the combat faster. So they added combo ranks, which I guess they incentivize the player to keep the combo up, and in general it's just how you keep the combat moving the whole time. For me, it's less fun because you're just constantly worrying about your combo. The levels only score you based on your max combo and how long it took you to clear that stage. So it feels like that's all that you're really worried about, is just keeping up a combo rather than actually fighting in an intelligent way. Now, I'm playing on medium difficulty and I don't think I've ever failed a mission, so it's not particularly difficult. So it really doesn't matter, but that just feels like a backwards way to solve the issue, because players are going to be more worried about the combo. You've made the game easier as a result. I guess I could play on hard mode, but that just means the enemies become bullet sponges and it doesn't make it any more fun. It just makes the stages last longer. And speaking of the combat, it's very simple, right? It's all lock-on stuff. There is an option to go into manual aim mode for your ranged weapons, but that you're never going to use that. Maybe against the boss enemies, because at certain points they have like weak spots that you have to hit to stagger them and make them, kind of stop for a bit, so you can get some free hits in. But I've never once used it. You can still use the auto aim to aim at those weak spots. You just have to mess around with the right analog stick and hope that it auto aims on the thing that you're trying to auto aim at. And look, that was an issue in the previous games too. The auto aim is kind of whatever, it just goes to anybody it feels like. But because that sort of precision wasn't as important in the previous games, it was totally forgivable. Now that you're so focused on hitting these specific parts and making sure that you're keeping your combo up, you really gotta fix that auto aim. I understand in the previous games you would get different parts based on what part of the enemy you were aiming at and what part you destroyed. You'd be more likely to get their arm parts if you destroyed their arm, but it just felt like most of the time you were just wailing on enemies anyway, because you destroy whatever parts you destroyed and you pick them up and you just replay the level and get the other parts if you didn't get them the first time. It was very rarely that you were specifically aiming for a specific part. Yeah, with very few exceptions. And I also feel like it was easier to do in the previous games because there was more UI direction in terms of what you were aiming at. So what are the other issues with Gundam Breaker 4? And I think the main one is the weird kind of focus on the diorama mode. It feels like they've really spent a lot of time trying to get the diorama mode working and trying to add parts and props for that. And I guess that's great for people who want to do that. I'm gonna guess that that's a big part of Gundam building, is you make these dioramas and stuff. But for a game, it tends to be less interesting. I imagine for a game, the fun of building these Gundams in a game versus real life is that you can use parts that maybe aren't made anymore. They're not in stock anywhere and it's difficult to get them, or they're super expensive. But the diorama stuff is like, you can do a diorama at home pretty easy provided you've got the parts. So that feels like it has less value than the actual Gundam breaking part. But I guess that's what they chose to focus on, and it just, for me, I see zero value in that. I'm sure some people appreciate that, but yeah, I really didn't. And the other issues are the lack of variety in the levels. Now, my main issue with Gundam Breaker 4 is that every single level with very, very few exceptions, feels like it's just randomly generated almost. And I know it's not, but it feels like it absolutely could be, right? You just put, okay, the location, stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3, put in the locations into the random generator. Okay, enemy Gundams, put those into the random generator. And mission type, yep, put those into the random generator. And then just stage 1 is this level, these Gundam, this mission type. You could say that's true for every game, but in this game it's so much more obvious because every single mission is 3 stages. You do the first stage and it's usually just kill all the Gundams. Sometimes it might be a bit more different because it's kill specific Gundams, and the only other type that you really get is, hey, defend this area, or defend this launch pod or whatever. And yeah, I mean, the slight variety is okay, but the previous games had so much more variety, and these games have zero progression in the levels. And I mean that, there's zero progression. Every single level is a square room. Even if it looks like you're outdoors, you're in a square room, you have no way to move around, you have nothing really blocking you. Sometimes there's hills or mountains in the way, but they're just a slight change in terrain. There's no way to really use that to your advantage. Maybe you can hide around the corner, but again, because these games are so easy, you're only wasting your time by hiding and stuff. Previous games would allow you to progress through an entire level. It felt like an actual level rather than just an arena fighter. And that's not what this is supposed to be. This isn't supposed to be like a arcade fighter, something like Gundam Versus. Like, that game made more sense. In this one, you're spending so much time creating your Gundam, but you're never gonna look at them, because you're just gonna be in this room. There's no like moment of clarity almost, where you've finished one encounter and you're moving to the next encounter, and you're just appreciating your surroundings and your Gundam, and yeah, this looks real good. Maybe I could do a slightly different color for this. There's none of that. Because what always happens is enemies spawn in front of you, you shoot them, more enemies spawn in front of you, you go on to the next stage, rinse and repeat, and that's it. And that's honestly the biggest problem with this game. Now, it might sound difficult to believe, but I do still like this game. I just think it's probably the weakest entry in the series, considering when the other games were released and the limitations at the time. I will finish it, but I just won't have as much fun with it as I did the other entries. And yeah, that's basically it.